I once killed a tomato plant with kindness, not neglect, kindness. I bought the expensive bag of soil, the blue powder fertilizer that promised tomatoes the size of my fist, and I followed the directions like they were scripture. I watered it, I fed it, I talked to it like a lunatic, and by August it was a yellow, stunted little thing producing tomatoes that tasted like wet paper. My neighbor, an 81-year-old man named Walt, who fertilizes nothing and waters even less, had a jungle. His tomatoes were obscene. I stood at the fence one evening, holding my one sad tomato, and Walt looked at it, looked at me, and said, "You fed the plant. I fed the dirt." I didn't understand what that meant for years. It turns out almost nobody does, and that misunderstanding nearly ended American agriculture once already, because we have actually done this before, on a national scale, and it was a catastrophe. Let me take you back to the 1930s, the Great Plains. For decades, settlers had been told the land was endless, that the soil was so deep and rich you could farm it forever. So they did. They ripped up the native prairie grass, the deep-rooted stuff that had held that ground together for 10,000 years, and they planted wheat, mile after mile of it. When wheat prices were high during the First World War, they tore up even more. Nobody rotated crops in any serious way. Nobody let the land rest. The dirt was a machine, and the machine was supposed to print money. Then the rain stopped. When the drought hit, there was nothing holding the topsoil down. No roots, no grass, just bare, pulverized dirt that the farmers had been plowing into fine powder for 20 years, and the wind picked it up. I'm not talking about a dusty afternoon. I'm talking about black walls of soil 2 miles high, rolling across Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas, turning noon into midnight. Children got lost walking home from school in their own yards. People nailed wet sheets over their windows and still woke up with their mouths full of grit. A single storm in May of 1934 lifted an estimated 300 million tons of topsoil and dropped some of it on ships 300 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. That is the part that gets me. The soil from an Oklahoma wheat farm landed on a boat in the ocean. The thing that took the prairie 10,000 years to build was gone in a single afternoon, scattered across the sea, and it is never coming back in our lifetimes or our great-grandchildren's lifetimes. Now, here is where the story gets strange, and here's the part that the modern fertilizer industry would very much prefer you forget. Because we figured out the fix. We figured it out almost immediately. There was a soil scientist named Hugh Hammond Bennett, stubborn man from North Carolina, and he had been screaming into the void for years that the way America farmed was suicidal. Nobody in Congress cared. Soil erosion was boring. Soil erosion did not win elections. So in April of 1935, Bennett was scheduled to testify in front of a Senate committee, and he did something I find genuinely magnificent. He stalled. He knew from the weather reports that a massive dust storm was traveling east from the plains all the way to Washington. So he talked, and he talked, and he dragged it out until the sky outside the Capitol windows turned brown and the sun disappeared, and dust from 1,000 miles away started settling on the senators' desks. And Bennett pointed out the window and said, "This, gentleman, is what I have been talking about." They funded him on the spot. The Soil Conservation Service was born that year, and the fix was not complicated. It was not high technology. It was more or less this: stop treating the dirt like it is dead. Cover it, rotate what you grow, put roots back in the ground, bring the animals back, let it rest. Feed the dirt, and the dirt feeds the plant. Which brings me back to Walt and his obscene tomatoes, but we will get there. So if we figured out the fix in 1935, you would assume we have been doing it ever since. We have not. What happened instead is that the Second World War ended, and the government was sitting on enormous stockpiles of two chemicals: ammonium nitrate, which had been used to make explosives and various nerve agents. And somebody realized that ammonium nitrate, the explosive, is also a fantastic source of nitrogen for plants. And the nerve agents, with a little tweaking, kill insects beautifully. So the explosives became fertilizer, and the nerve agents became pesticides, and the entire chemical apparatus of the war got pointed at the American farm. And for a while, it looked like a miracle. Yields went through the roof. You did not need to rotate crops anymore because you could just dump nitrogen on the same field forever. You did not need animals or manure or cover crops or rest. You could grow corn, then corn, then corn again on the same exhausted dirt as long as you kept the chemicals coming. The dirt became once again just a machine, a thing you stick plants into and pour chemicals onto. The actual living soil underneath did not matter because the chemicals did its job for it. Except the chemicals do not do its job for it. They do one part of the job and quietly destroy the rest. Because here is the thing almost nobody outside of a soil lab understands. Healthy soil is not dirt. Healthy soil is alive. A single tablespoon of it contains more living organisms than there are human beings on the entire planet. Billions of bacteria, miles of fungal threads, microscopic creatures all trading nutrients back and forth in a marketplace older than the dinosaurs. The plant roots feed sugar to the fungi, and the fungi go out and mine minerals from the rock and deliver them back to the roots like a delivery service. That is what real fertility is. It is a living economy underground. And when you dump synthetic nitrogen on it year after year, you bankrupt that economy. The plant stops feeding the fungi because why pay the delivery service when free food is raining from the sky? The fungal network collapses, the bacteria die off. The whole living web that took centuries to build just unravels, and you are left with what is technically still called soil, but is really just a dead sponge that holds chemicals. It looks fine. The corn grows, but the dirt is a corpse on life support, and the life support is a tanker truck full of nitrogen that has to come back every single year, forever. I want to give you one number, because it stopped me cold when I first read it. The state of Iowa, some of the richest farmland that has ever existed anywhere on Earth, has lost an average of 6.8 inches of its topsoil since 1850. 6.8 inches gone, washed into the Gulf of Mexico mostly. And topsoil does not go back on any timeline that matters to a human being. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates it takes up to 1,000 years for nature to build 3 centimeters of the stuff. 1,000 years for an inch. And we are losing it globally at a rate that one official described as 30 football fields of soil every single minute. Now, I have to be honest with you here because the internet loves a tidy apocalypse, and I am not going to sell you one. Back in 2014, that same UN agency put out a warning that got turned into a viral headline. The world has only 60 harvests left. 60 years and the soil is finished. It was everywhere. There is a whole documentary built around it, and it is a genuinely useful scare, except a researcher at Oxford named Hannah Ritchie went and actually checked the math, and the 60 harvest number does not really hold up. Soils degrade at wildly different rates. Some are barely eroding at all. There is no single doomsday clock ticking down to the same midnight for every field on Earth. But, and this is the part the debunkers sometimes skate past, the underlying problem is completely real. We are mining our soil instead of farming it. We are spending down a savings account that took 10,000 years to fill, and we are pretending it is income. So this is the gear shift. This is where I stop talking about Iowa and ships in the Atlantic and ask you something directly. When was the last time a store-bought tomato actually tasted like anything? You are not imagining it. The food really has gotten blander, and in many cases measurably less nutritious than what your grandparents ate. Studies tracking the mineral content of fruits and vegetables over the last 70 years find real declines in iron and calcium in a whole list of things. And the reason is not some mystery. You cannot pull minerals out of soil that no longer has a living network to deliver them. The plant grows big and green and waterlogged on nitrogen, but it is starving for everything else. And then you eat it, and you are quietly starving too. The yellow tomato I grew, the one Walt laughed at, was not a freak accident. It was a tiny, personal version of the exact thing happening to an entire continent. So who actually kept the old knowledge alive? Who never tore up the prairie, never bought the explosive fertilizer miracle, never treated the dirt like a corpse? The communities everyone else thinks of as quaintly behind the times. The Mennonites, the plain farmers, the people we drive past and feel a little sorry for because they are doing it the hard way. Except it turns out the hard way is the only way that does not end in a black blizzard. Walk onto a traditional Mennonite farm and you will see the entire 1935 fix still running, unbroken, as if the chemical revolution simply never arrived. They rotate their crops on cycles that go back generations, so the same field is never asked to grow the same thing into exhaustion. Some communities practice a long soil rest, leaving ground fallow on a multi-year rhythm so the living web underneath can rebuild. They keep animals, and the animals are not a separate business from the crops. They are part of the same loop. The cows eat the forage, the manure goes back to the field, and that manure is not waste. It is the single best food you can give to that underground economy of bacteria and fungi. They plant cover crops in the off-season so the dirt is never left naked to the wind, which is the exact mistake that buried Oklahoma. They keep the soil covered, fed, rested, and alive. There is nothing mystical about it. They are not praying the fertility into the ground. They are running by hand and by habit and by stubborn tradition, the most advanced soil science we have, the kind that places like the Rodale Institute have been confirming in controlled trials since 1981, and the kind that a North Dakota rancher named Gabe Brown rebuilt his entire bankrupt operation around. Modern regenerative agriculture, the cutting-edge thing being rediscovered in agricultural colleges right now, is in almost every meaningful way just a slideshow about what the plain farmers never stopped doing. The Mennonites did not preserve this knowledge because they read the soil studies. They preserved it because they were suspicious of the shortcut, because a tradition that tells you to feed the land and let it rest is a tradition that quietly protects you from the kind of thinking that drops your topsoil onto a boat in the Atlantic Ocean. So I think about Walt at the fence a lot, an old man who has never read a single paper on mycorrhizal fungi, holding a tomato the size of a softball, telling me the entire secret in 5 words. You fed the plant, I fed the dirt. He was not giving me gardening advice. He was, without knowing it, describing the difference between the farm that survives and the farm that turns into a dust storm. The whole scandal of modern soil, the thing that took me a dead tomato and a long detour through the 1930s to finally understand, is just that one sentence said by an old man who was right about everything,